Hey everybody, welcome back. We are talking now about where you live matters, and that's both a where you live in terms of your geographic location, the zip code in which you live, the country in which you live, state in which you live, etc., as well as the housing structure, the type of structure in which you live. So first I want to talk a little bit about your zip code. If you've ever seen, there's this great video, if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it, called Unnatural Causes in Sickness and in Wealth. And the question is inequality making us sick? And there's this really great discussion about how people living and working at the same institution lived in different zip codes, and basically how the expectation, their lifespan differed by years based on the zip code in which they lived. And you saw that, the CEO of this hospital system, had the highest income and highest socioeconomic status, lived in a great neighborhood with lots of parks where he felt safe, where he could go running. And his life expectancy was much higher than, say, the poorest person introduced in the story, who lived in a neighborhood with higher rates of crime, had a built environment that wasn't very encouraging of spending time outdoors and being physically active, rarely had a vacation, was often stressed about finances, and that the lifespan difference between these two individuals varied to up to 20 years, again, based on their income and also based on where they lived. If you remember back to the assigned reading I had you guys read back in week 1, it was Tom Frieden's Health Impact Pyramid. And in that impact pyramid, it started integrating social determinants of health as part of a model of predicting how healthy you'd be. And socioeconomic factors, really, such as like housing and education and minimum wage earnings, kind of really were found at the bottom of this pyramid. If you compared it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you'd also find that at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid, you'd find that such things as, food and water and shelter are some of your greatest needs. So is housing and shelter, again, falling at your greatest needs. So again, this is a large social determinant of health where, again, if you have housing, what type of housing, and where is that housing located, all can greatly impact your health and well-being. So how does where you live affect your health? I just thought I'd include this. It is a little bit of an older publication from 2004, but it's still very relevant. And it shows the various aspects of how the type of housing structure you live in, as well as where you live, can impact directly and indirectly your health outcomes. It can affect, what are the conditions of life inside your home? Do you have a home that's damp and cold, potentially moldy? That increases cardiovascular disease, it increases stress, it increases depression, it exacerbates pre-existing respiratory related health illnesses, as well as, what is the community like, or the neighborhood level like where you live? Is it safe? Do you feel like you trust your neighbors? Do you feel like, you live in a very connected neighborhood? Do you have access to services that you need, or not? So just thought this was kind of interesting. Housing inadequacy has been on the rise as of recently. Now, granted, again, this is a little bit older information, but you see the reduction in housing adequacy. We'll talk about, again, the physical home and how that can impact health. Again, you might remember from talking about, the Industrial Revolution, and how, cities without this municipal waste and sanitation system, right, kind of had increased risk of infectious disease, had a compromised water supply, ventilation in homes led to people getting sick more often, food storage, and how you, again, kept your food and kept vermin and kept, roaches and rats from getting into your food supply. Could all be negatively affected. Your trash disposal could increase risk for infectious disease. Crowding could lead to the more rampant spread of infectious diseases. So again, these are ways that housing conditions can infect infectious disease. They can also impact chronic diseases. Um, Damp, cold, and moldy housing is associated with asthma and other chronic respiratory symptoms, even after controlling for such things as income, social class, smoking, and crowding. Water intrusion is a major contributor to problems with dampness. Damp houses provide a nurturing environment for mites and roaches, respiratory viruses, and molds, all of which play a role in respiratory disease. Old and dirty carpeting, often found in substandard housing, is also an important reservoir for dust and allergens and toxic chemicals, all which are linked back to respiratory, neurological, and hematologic or bloodborne illness. Also, within homes that have pest infestations, this increases the risk of asthma, as they can increase allergic sensitization and have emerged as an important asthma trigger. So again, just kind of linking back some of these conditions to chronic disease development. Homes can also be the site for injuries, which some of the most common injuries are linked back to falls as well as access to chemicals, which can lead to poisoning. But here are a whole host of other injuries, again, accidental injuries that can be caused by where you live. Your housing can also impact your mental health. And again, if you guys remember when the housing bubble burst, right, and there was basically the housing market fell. Arizona was one of these states. Arizona and actually Florida as well were the two states most affected by the housing crisis, and it was largely predatory lending in both of these states that led to people not being able to pay for their mortgage at the time when we had a financial crisis in the United States. And this can the fear of paying your next paycheck, not paying your paycheck, the fear of paying your next mortgage payment, of being able to pay rent, can greatly impact your mental health and well-being. So of course, again, these all impact the likelihood that you'd experience some kind of negative mental health condition. Home ownership and why it's important. Home ownership is a way of building equity. And it's healthy for individuals for numerous reasons. When structured in a safe and sustainable way, home ownership offers families the opportunity to build wealth. Home equity typically represents the largest single contributor to a family's net worth, and they can draw on equity to cover expenses during retirement, to start a small business, or even to send a child to college. Perhaps most importantly, the wealth generated by home equity can be transferred to future generations, thus contributing to financial stability and well-being in the future. By the way, nearly half of all renters spend about more than 1/3 of their monthly income on rent. The cost of rent has been increasing over time, depending on where you live. And again, if you are paying more than 1/3 of your income on rent and food, that puts you at food insecurity and home insecurity, and housing insecurity. So home ownership is healthy overall. It builds financial wealth. It increases graduation rates. It increases the likelihood of children having good health and increasing their educational attainment, and it increases a family's net wealth. There we go. So housing as a vaccine. I remember reading about this in a publication that was in American Public. It was the American Journal of Public Health. And I thought it was just such an interesting concept to compare housing as a vaccine. This one-time shot, you really have this long-lasting protective intervention by ensuring a certain condition. And, vaccine being a, early exposure to a deadened or very weak and strained or completely dead virus to really enhance your body's memory of how to fight off that condition in the case that you were exposed to, a live, a more virulent strain of whatever it is that you encountered that could lead to illness, right? And so housing as a vaccine, just thought this was interesting. This is kind of this ensuring people have this one resource can really help impact their mental and physical well-being in a number of ways. So is this a new idea? Well, not so much. The notion of housing as a public health issue is not new. In the middle of the 19th century, there's a pathologist, his name was Rudolf Virchow, and he advised city leaders that poorly maintained crowded housing was associated with higher rates of infectious disease transmission. So interest in housing as a determinant of health has fluctuated over time, and really, again, beginning to, put housing at the forefront of economic policy as a public health policy is really pretty critical to try to make sure that people can have healthier lives. And so next up, we'll talk a little bit more about your neighborhood and how that impacts your health. However, I just want to mention that housing is so important to health and health outcomes. There's an entire housing and urban development sector of the government which aims to ensure that people have access to healthy housing. So it's not just about owning a home, but it's also about how affordable is it to own a home where you live. I just thought this was really interesting to show you where homes are a bit more affordable and where they're less affordable. And it's also not just a matter of being able to afford a home, but let's say that you can't afford a home in a certain area of town, but you still work in a city center. Traditionally, city centers are much more expensive to live. And where it's a little bit cheaper to live tends to be out in the suburbs, right? So we're going back to that built environment and the idea of sprawl. More often, it's cheaper and you can have larger homes and more room, especially if you have children, right? It's easier to live outside of the city and commute in. Well, there's kind of something you have to take into consideration is, do you have a car? Is it a reliable car? Can you afford the gas to be able to commute between your home that's further away from where you work? It's also a trade-off on, do you pay more to live closer to the city center or closer potentially to where you work? Not everyone works in the city center, but do you pay a bit more and not spend on other aspects, right? Like potentially not have to own a car? Or do you own a car and have to make sure that you increase its reliability, but reduce the amount that you're paying for a home? So often it's housing and transportation and weighing your pros and cons of where you live in conjunction to whether or not in relation to whether or not you'd be commuting, that people have to weigh their options when deciding where to live, how long their commute will be, and so on. Another impact of housing and how it can impact your health is residential segregation. This largely has to do with zoning laws, over time, gentrification, and residential segregation, especially residential racial segregation, is actually pretty unhealthy. This is something that was talked about in your textbook in your textbook. Residential segregation has led to highly segregated schooling, which causes racial differences in quality of education. Largely, public schools are paid for by property tax. So if you've got a super low income neighborhood and you don't have a lot of, the tax dollars going into that neighborhood tend to be lower, that's tax dollars that, are not necessarily going into education, the public education. And so if you're living in that area, the chances are you're receiving a lesser education as compared to the public schools that are in wealthier neighborhoods. Segregated schools have lower average test scores, fewer students in advanced placement courses, more limited curricula, sometimes less qualified teachers, less access to serious academic counseling, fewer connections with colleges and employers to help set students up for success, more deteriorated buildings, higher levels of teen pregnancy, and often higher dropout rates. So again, what ends up being the healthiest for all is a mixed income, as mixed racial, ethnic, demographic makeup of neighborhoods is what's healthiest, especially for lower income populations, and it does not have a negative impact on those higher income populations. These conditions that are present in lower income neighborhoods often contribute to peer pressure against academic achievement and in support of substance abuse and crime. They also have higher levels of abandoned buildings and groups, relatively large numbers of commercial and industrial facilities, and inadequate municipal services and amenities, such as fire protection and police. They tend to have more substandard housing, elevated noise levels, generally more crowding, an inability to regulate temperature and humidity in homes, and elevated exposure to toxic pollutants and allergens. So again, kind of based on what you read in your textbook as well as what you're learning here, is that this residential segregation, it's the more segregated areas have poor health outcomes and poor overall life outcomes. I just thought, again, this was pretty interesting, where you can see that there are certain areas that have led to creating and maintaining wealth inequality, and they have increased residential segregation, and this has contributed to generations of people, largely of color, who've had a harder time achieving home ownership and building that equity they need to kind of move on to the next level of socioeconomic status, as well as be able to achieve some of the education levels, which in turn can impact your career, which in turn can impact, again, your livelihood, your financial well-being in the future. So all of these social determinants of health really are interconnected. There are a series of policies that have been aimed at reducing these residential segregations based on, again, income, as well as racial, ethnic, demographic segregation. On another level is concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty, as you've read in the chapter in your textbook, has a cumulative effect on your health and well-being over time. It can undermine a strong work ethic. It can devalue academic success, and it can remove the social stigma of improvement, as well as educational and economic failure. Not improvement, but imprisonment. So areas of concentrated poverty, some of the general rules of society for how to get ahead are sometimes undermined, and it can lead to, the longer you stay in an area of concentrated poverty, the more negative effects it has on your overall health and well-being. I just thought this was interesting. Again, a little bit older, but it just shows you areas of the country that have higher rates of concentrated poverty. And you see that parts of, our state, parts of Phoenix and Tucson have areas that exhibit concentrated levels of poverty. So again, it can impact your education by not having property taxes that are used to, again, contribute to education systems, especially if you're going to a public school. And that can negatively impact, again, your ability to get ahead, to pursue a higher level of education. That can impact your job opportunities and impact your economic and career mobility. Poorer communities also have children who are at least 3 times more likely to be out of school. But if they had a stable and secure home, they'd have a better place to do homework, less missed school days because of illness, financial security that helps them achieve a whole host of financial resources that can help them focus on learning, like having enough to eat, right? And lead to a clear path of employment and a brighter future overall. It can lead to job insecurity. So often these homes where people are, where there are higher rates of homelessness, you see higher rates of unemployment, lower rates of wages, especially for men, and then also for single-headed families, which are often female-headed households. This lack of jobs in these poor areas can produce high rates of male unemployment, underemployment, which in turn underlies the high rates of out-of-wedlock births, large number of female-headed households, which can lead to the feminization of poverty and extreme concentration of poverty, largely in African American and Black communities. So again, all of these are interrelated. The poor housing, the unaffordable housing, job security, individuals' personal income, right? Family income are all intertwined and again, impact where you live, how you live, the conditions in which you live, which we know impacts your health. I thought this was interesting. There's also something kind of known as the poverty tax, which is this hidden tax paid by the poor, basically because they're poor. So take, for instance, if you were to get a check and you didn't have a checking account, you'd have to take to your check to a place that would cash your check. And because you don't have a bank account, they're going to take with these individuals that are not individuals, these organizations that can cash your check because you don't have because it's an unbanked or you don't have a bank account, there are often fees that you pay because you're not banking with a particular bank. So over time, this can add up and it can end up eating into a large amount of your paycheck when, again, you're going to these locations that charge you to cash your check. There are also credit card companies that cater to those who cater to individuals who have low credit scores. But often people who apply for these types of credit cards, the credit cards have a high annual fees and also really high interest rates. So you put something on your credit card and the high interest rate can make it so that if you don't pay whatever you charge in a timely manner, you start increasing the amount of interest you have to pay on that original loan, and that can increase what you end up having to pay back by interest rates of 20-25%. Where you live also can impact your food availability. So certain neighborhoods have more amounts of grocery stores and of places that sell fresh food so that you don't have to rely on a corner store or fast food to get to meet your nutritional needs. We'll talk about this in much more detail next week when we talk about food access. There have been some policies that have been put into place to help people try to overcome poverty, to overcome predatory lending, and to help people be able to finance homes. And so here are just some examples of policies and reform that have been put into place. There was the Dodd-Frank Act, which was this comprehensive financial regulatory reform that was passed after the Great Recession, and it was implemented to really help curb the amount of predatory lending that led to the housing bubble bursting in the first place. So really trying to make sure that there was greater transparency on Wall Street, and again, that there was really more regulation on those who were lending to individuals who didn't have a high credit score and availability to pay back what they say what they're borrowing for their mortgage over time, so that people didn't have to file bankruptcy and also lose their home like what occurred during the housing crisis. There's the Housing and Economic Recovery Act of 2008. It was funds set aside by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the National Housing Trust Fund, and it dedicated a fund to help provide revenue to build, preserve, and rehabilitate housing for people that pay more than half of their income towards rent or towards housing. So again, aimed at really trying to help people who use most of their income and less of it goes towards food and less of it goes towards fuel and other needs in their life to live a healthy, happy life, right? Healthy and financially well-off life. Okay, there's also the Affirmatively Further Fair Housing Rule, and this bolstered the implementation of the Fair Housing Act. And basically, this went towards developing more diverse, inclusive communities that aimed at increasing the amount of job opportunities, good jobs, as well as investments in school and healthcare for areas that had previously been categorized as impoverished. The Housing and Urban Development also has created something called Fair Housing Guidelines to try to make sure that people who had previously undergone discrimination in being able to apply for and achieve programs that would help for housing and housing claims, that this was a practice to reduce the amounts of discrimination based on your sexual orientation, your status as a survivor of domestic violence, and again, to avoid discrimination and help people obtain more affordable housing. So again, these are some of these more upstream factors and policies that are meant to help increase people's likelihood and ability to afford their own homes. So that's it for this lecture. Again, make sure you read your book. It's a pretty short textbook chapter on housing as a social determinant of health. And all of these together are really kind of what this is kind of the end of your video lectures for what we're going to discuss in terms of built environment. It's basically its own area of research and area of study. You could even get your own master's or pursue a degree in built environment. It's a super fascinating area, and again, a true social determinant of health, encompassing many of other, sub social determinants of health, combined. But nevertheless, that's the end of this lecture, and I hope you enjoyed learning. Thanks.